Ethan, are you even listening to me? Lucas's voice cut through the haze of my thoughts, sharp and teasing. I blinked, realizing I'd been staring at him, caught in the way his lips curled into that half smile of his, the one that always seemed to hover on the edge of something more. Sorry, I mumbled, dragging a hand through my hair. What were you saying? He leaned back against the couch, his arm brushing mine, and I could feel the warmth of him even through the fabric of his shirt. I said, he drawled, his tone light, but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. Why don't I just stay over tonight? It's late, and I don't feel like walking back. My heart stuttered, and I forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. Since when do you care about walking back? It's what, 2 blocks? He shrugged, that smile still playing on his lips. Since tonight. Besides, you've got that spare room. Or, his eyes flicked to mine, holding my gaze for a beat too long. We could just share the couch. Like old times. Old times. The words echoed in my head, and I couldn't help but think back to how this, whatever this was, had started. Lucas had moved into the apartment across the hall a little over a year ago, and from the moment I'd met him, there'd been something about him that drew me in. He had this effortless charm, a way of filling a room without even trying. At first, we were just neighbors, friendly, sure, but nothing more. We'd exchange hellos in the hallway, maybe chat for a few minutes if we ran into each other at the mailboxes. But then, one night, he knocked on my door with a 6-pack and a sheepish grin, saying he didn't know anyone in the building yet, and figured I'd be good company. We'd ended up talking for hours that night, sprawled on my couch, the empty beer bottles piling up on the coffee table. He'd told me about his life before moving here, the job he'd left behind, the breakup that had sent him packing. And in turn, I'd found myself opening up in ways I hadn't with anyone else in years. There was something about Lucas, his easy laughter, the way he listened, really listened, that made it hard not to let him in. Over time, he became a regular part of my life. We'd watch movies, order takeout, sometimes just sit in comfortable silence as the hours slipped by. It was easy, uncomplicated, or at least it had been. But then, something had started to shift. It was subtle at first, the way he'd linger a little longer than necessary when he hugged me goodbye, the way his gaze would catch mine and hold it just a beat too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just Lucas being Lucas. But then came the comments, the light teasing that felt like it carried the weight of something more. You're staring again, he'd say, his voice low and amused, and I'd feel my face heat. Or, you're cute when you're flustered, and I'd fumble for a response, my mind racing. It wasn't just the words, though. It was the way he'd sit closer than he used to, our shoulders brushing, his knee bumping mine. The way he'd casually drape an arm over the back of the couch, his fingers just grazing my shoulder. It was the way he'd look at me sometimes, like he was seeing something I wasn't ready to show him. And now, here we were, sitting on that same couch, the air between us heavy with something I couldn't name. Lucas was still looking at me, his expression unreadable, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step back or jump. So, he prompted, his voice soft now, almost tentative. What do you say? I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. Yeah, sure, you can stay. The corner of his mouth quirked up, but there was something restless in his eyes, like he was waiting for me to say more. I couldn't. Instead, I stood abruptly, muttering something about getting some blankets, and escaped to the hallway closet. But when I came back, blankets in hand, Lucas was standing by the window, his back to me, his shoulders tense. He turned when he heard me, and the look on his face, raw, vulnerable, stopped me in my tracks. Ethan, he began, his voice wavering, and I felt my stomach twist. There's something I need to tell you. He took a step toward me, and I instinctively took a step back, my heart pounding. Lucas, But before I could finish, he closed the distance between us, his hands reaching for mine. I can't keep pretending, he said, his eyes searching mine. I can't keep acting like this, like you don't mean everything to me. I stared at him, my mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Lucas was my friend. But the way he was looking at me, the way his hands felt in mine. His fingers tightened around mine, pulling me closer, and I didn't resist. My breath hitched as his other hand came up to cup my face, his thumb brushing over my cheek. I've been trying to tell you, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Trying to show you. But I didn't know if you felt the same. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, my heart pounding as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine so softly it was barely a touch. But it was enough to send a shiver down my spine, to make my stomach flip. Lucas, I breathed, my voice barely audible. I don't know if I'll, but he didn't let me finish. His lips met mine again, firmer this time, and I felt something inside me give way. My hands found his waist, pulling him closer, and suddenly, nothing else mattered. Not the questions, not the doubts, just him and me in this moment. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm on my skin. "Tell me you feel it too," he murmured, his voice trembling. "Tell me I'm not the only one." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Because the truth was, I didn't know what I felt. All I knew was that in that moment, nothing had ever felt more right. The room was quiet except for the sound of our breathing, the air between us heavy with words left unspoken. Lucas's forehead still pressed against mine, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. I could feel the weight of his gaze, searching mine for answers I wasn't sure I could give. "I don't know," I finally whispered, my voice breaking the silence like glass. "I don't know what I feel, Lucas. It's all so unexpected." He pulled back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Unexpected isn't always a bad thing, Ethan," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of that playful lilt I'd grown so used to. But there was something else there too, something vulnerable, raw. Sometimes it's just real. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Real. The word echoed in my head, twisting and turning, trying to find a place to settle. Was this real? Was I ready for it to be? "You're not going to let me off easy, are you?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood, but my voice betrayed me, cracking under the pressure of my own uncertainty. He chuckled softly, a sound that felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. "Not a chance," he said, his fingers tracing idle circles on my shoulders. "You're stuck with me, Ethan. For better or worse." I laughed despite myself, the tension in my chest easing just a little. "You're relentless, you know that?" "It's part of my charm," he said with a wink, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a seriousness there, a quiet determination that made my heart ache in a way I wasn't ready to examine. We sat there for what felt like hours, the silence between us growing comfortable, almost comforting. His presence was grounding, like an anchor in the middle of a storm. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something big, something that would change everything. "Do you ever feel like you're just waiting for the other shoe to drop?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the question. "All the time," he admitted. "But sometimes, Ethan, you just have to take the leap, even if you're scared." "And if I'm not ready to leap?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a small, almost sad smile that made my chest tighten. "Then I'll wait," he said simply. "I'm not going anywhere." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, the tension in my shoulders easing just a little. "You're really something, you know that?" He laughed, the sound warm and genuine this time. "So I've been told," he said, leaning back against the couch but keeping his hand on mine, his fingers intertwining with my own. "But for what it's worth, Ethan, I think you're something too." I looked down at our joined hands, the simplicity of the gesture striking me. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt monumental, like a promise, or maybe just a beginning. "Lucas," I started, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what this is. I don't know what it means. But I know that I don't want to lose you. Not over this. Not over anything." He squeezed my hand gently, his expression soft. "You won't," he said firmly. "No matter what happens, Ethan, you won't lose me." I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me like a blanket. It was a promise, one I wasn't sure I deserved, but one I clung to all the same. We stayed like that for a while, the silence between us comfortable, almost healing. But eventually, the fatigue of the day caught up with me, and I felt my eyelids growing heavy. "You should get some sleep," Lucas said softly, his voice laced with concern. "You look like you're about to pass out." I chuckled, the sound coming out more like a groan. "I feel like it too," I admitted, rubbing my eyes. "But what about you? Are you staying?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to the door and then back to me. "Do you want me to?" he asked, his voice careful, like he was afraid of the answer. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I let myself feel the truth of what I wanted. "Yes," I said simply, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Stay." He smiled, a slow, warm smile that made my heart skip a beat. "All right," he said, standing up and offering me his hand. "Let's get you to bed." I took his hand, letting him pull me to my feet, and together we walked to my bedroom. The familiarity of the gesture struck me, how natural it felt, how right. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this was where I was supposed to be. He waited by the door as I climbed into bed, the sheets cool against my skin. "Good night, Ethan," he said softly, lingering for a moment before turning to leave. "Wait," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned back, his eyebrows raised in question. "Yeah." I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "Stay," I said again, the words sounding louder this time, more certain. He looked at me, his expression unreadable for a moment, and then he nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "All right," he said, walking back to the bed and sitting down on the edge. "I'll stay." The mattress dipped under his weight as he lay down beside me, his body warm and solid against mine. I turned to face him, our eyes meeting in the dim light of the room. "Lucas," I started, my voice trembling slightly. I want you to know that you mean a lot to me, more than I think I've let myself admit." He reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek, his touch gentle, almost reverent. "You mean a lot to me too, Ethan," he said softly. "More than you know." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a warm blanket. "Good," I whispered, closing the distance between us just enough to feel his breath on my skin. That's good." He smiled, a slow, warm smile that made my heart ache in the best possible way. "Good," he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. And then, without another word, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, tender, and filled with everything we hadn't yet said. I felt something inside me shift, like a door I hadn't known was closed suddenly swinging open. And as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, I let myself fall into the moment, into him, into the possibility of something more. The world outside faded away, leaving nothing but the two of us, the warmth of his body against mine, and the unspoken promise hanging in the air between us. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was where I was meant to be. I woke up to the faint glow of morning light filtering through the blinds, my body tangled in the warmth of Lucas's. His arm was draped over my chest, his breath steady and soft against my neck. The weight of him was comforting, familiar in a way that surprised me. I lay there for a moment, letting the memories of the night before wash over me. The way his lips had felt against mine, the way his touch had lingered, as if he was afraid I might pull away. But I hadn't. I'd stayed, I'd let him in, and now here we were. I shifted slightly, trying not to wake him, but his arm tightened around me almost instinctively. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned my head to look at him, his face still relaxed with the remnants of sleep. There was something about him in this moment, something raw and unfiltered, that made my chest tighten. He blinked his eyes open, meeting mine with a softness that made my breath catch. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on my arm. "Good," I said, swallowing hard. "You?" He smiled, that half smile of his that always seemed to hint at something more. "Better than I have in a long time." There was a pause, a moment where neither of us knew what to say. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words, with questions that neither of us was ready to ask. But then he shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look down at me. His other hand came up to brush a strand of hair from my face, his touch so gentle it made my heart ache. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and serious. "Last night, it meant something to me, more than I can really put into words." I felt my breath hitch. Here it was, the moment I'd been both dreading and craving. The moment where we'd have to face what this was, what it could be. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He took a deep breath, his eyes searching mine. "I know this is complicated, and I don't want to push you or make you feel like you have to figure everything out right now. But I need you to know that I'm in this. Whatever this is, I'm in it." I stared at him, my mind racing. What was this? Friendship? Something more? The lines between us had blurred so much over the past few weeks that I wasn't sure I could even tell where one ended and the other began. But looking at him now, with the morning light painting his face in soft gold, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't want to let this go. "Lucas," I started, my voice shaky. I don't know what this is either. But I know that last night, it meant something to me too. And I know that I don't want to lose what we have." He exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath waiting for me to say something. "You won't," he said, his voice firm. "No matter what happens, you won't lose me." There was a finality to his words, a promise that made my chest tighten even more. I reached up, my hand brushing against his cheek, and he leaned into the touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "Together." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He leaned down, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was just as tender as the ones we'd shared the night before. But this one felt different. This one felt like a new beginning. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath mingling with mine. "We should probably get up," he said, though he made no move to do so. I laughed softly, the sound surprising even me. "Probably." But neither of us moved. We stayed there, wrapped up in each other, in the quiet of the morning, in the promise of what was to come. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Later that day, we found ourselves sitting on the couch, a movie playing in the background that neither of us was really paying attention to. My mind kept drifting back to the night before, to the morning, to the way Lucas's lips had felt against mine. It was like I couldn't focus on anything else. "Hey," Lucas said, nudging me gently with his elbow. "You okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was entirely true. "Yeah, just thinking." He tilted his head, studying me. "About?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. But then I looked at him, at the way his eyes were focused on me, at the way he seemed to genuinely care about what I was feeling, and I knew I couldn't hold back. "About last night. And this morning. About us." He nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, me too." There was a pause, and then he reached over, taking my hand in his. His grip was firm, grounding. "Whatever happens, Ethan," I meant what I said. "I'm in this. I'm not going anywhere." I looked down at our intertwined hands, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a way that sent shivers up my spine. I don't want to mess this up," I said softly. "You won't," he said immediately. "We won't. As long as we're honest with each other, as long as we're both willing to figure this out, we'll be okay." I glanced up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "And if I'm scared," he smiled, that same half smile that always seemed to make my stomach flip. "Then we'll face it together." There was something about the way he said it, so confidently, so reassuringly, that made me believe him. Maybe this could work. Maybe we could figure it out. We sat there for a while longer, the movie forgotten, just talking. About everything and nothing. About our fears, our hopes, our pasts. And with each word, with each moment, I felt the walls around my heart start to crumble a little more. At one point, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was so soft, so tender, it made my chest ache. "We're going to be okay," he whispered against my lips. And for the first time, I truly believed him. But as the hours passed and the day turned into evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much unsaid between us. So much that we hadn't yet confronted. And as we lay there that night, his arms around me, his breath warm against my skin, I couldn't help but wonder what the next step was. What this all meant. "Lucas," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he replied, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. I hesitated, unsure of how to put my thoughts into words. Do you think we're moving too fast?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look down at me. "Do you feel like we are?" I looked up at him, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlight outside the window. "I don't know," I admitted. "Sometimes it feels like everything's happening so quickly, and other times it feels like this is exactly where we're supposed to be." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that," he said, "but I think sometimes you just have to trust the way you feel. And right now, I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be. With you." His words sent a warmth spreading through my chest, but there was still a part of me that couldn't shake the uncertainty. What if this changes everything? What if we can't go back to the way things were? He reached up, his hand cupping my cheek. "Then we'll figure out what comes next," he said, his voice steady. "But Ethan, I don't want to go back. I want to move forward. With you." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "And if I'm not ready for that?" He smiled, that same half smile that always seemed to make my stomach flip. "Then I'll wait. As long as it takes." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Lucas." I didn't know what to say. Lucas's words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken, like the weight of a storm cloud before it breaks. His hand was still on my cheek, warm and steady, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I could feel the rhythm of his breath, soft and even, against my skin, and it made my chest ache in a way I couldn't quite explain. "You'd really wait?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. "Even if it takes, I don't know, forever?" He chuckled softly, the sound low and intimate, sending shivers down my spine. "Forever's a long time," he said, his thumb brushing lightly over my cheekbone. "But for you? Yeah, I'd wait." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. For me, the way he said it, like it was the simplest thing in the world, like I was worth it, it made my head spin. I wasn't used to this, to someone looking at me the way Lucas did, with that mix of tenderness and intensity that made my stomach flutter. "Lucas," I started, but he shook his head, silencing me before I could finish. "Don't overthink it," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Just be here with me, right now. That's all I'm asking." I nodded slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Okay," I whispered, the word barely audible. "I can do that." His smile widened, just a little, and he leaned in closer, until our foreheads were almost touching. "Good," he murmured, his breath warm against my lips. "Because I'm not going anywhere." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but it was impossible with him this close. His presence was overwhelming, filling every inch of the space around me, and I could feel the heat radiating from his body, pulling me in like a magnet. I wanted to move closer, to close the gap between us, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. "Not yet." "Ethan," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at me." I opened my eyes, and he was right there, so close I could see the faint flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. There was something in his gaze, something soft and vulnerable, that made my chest tighten. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine, like he was trying to find the words to say something important. "I know this is a lot," he said finally, "and I know you're scared, but I want you to know that I'm not going to push you. I'll give you all the time you need, but I also need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." I stared at him, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. "Why?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. "Why me? Why now?" He smiled, that same half-smile that always seemed to undo me. "Because it's you," he said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because I've never felt like this with anyone else. And because I think you feel it too." I didn't know what to say to that. He was right. I did feel it. I felt it every time he looked at me, every time he touched me, every time he was close enough for me to catch the faint scent of his cologne. It was there, this thing between us, this connection that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. "I do," I admitted quietly, my